Marion Stalybra set her name in the parish register in a hand that did not shake, and the man she had married that morning stood a yard off at the cold chancel rail and did not once look at her face. He had wed her to spite his father. He had told her so himself, plainly 3 days before, in a voice with no cruelty in it and no warmth either, as a man states the price of a thing he means to buy. And she had heard him out, and weighed her own want of any better road, and had come up the dale in the frost to marry a stranger who did not want her, with her eyes open. That was the whole of the bargain, and she had read it twice in her own mind before she trusted it. She was 23, slight, a little under middle height, with dark chestnut hair pinned low and plain, because a portionless gentlewoman keeps no maid to dress it, and hazel eyes that had the steady patience of a person who has sat long by sick beds and balanced small accounts and learned not to spend what she has not got. Her hands were a curate's daughter's hands, careful and a little chapped with cold. A grey shadow of writing ink worn into the cleft of the right middle finger from copying her late father's sermons fair these many years. She wore her best grey merino and her mother's darned lace at the cuff, and a faded rose shawl drawn close, for the church was bone cold, and her blood was thin with a long winter and a thin table, and she felt the new ring sit strange and heavy on her finger, a band a half size too large, put on by a man who had not thought to ask the size. The witness on her side was Mrs. Goodlake, the housekeeper of the house she was going to, a square, upright woman of 60 in good black who had stood up for the bride because the bride had no one of her own. There had been no one to give her away but the old clergyman of this very parish, the Reverend Mr. Quaintance, who had buried her father a 12-month since out of charity, and now married the daughter into Rayfell out of the same. And when it was signed and witnessed and done, and the few words said over them in the empty frosted church, the new Mrs. Daventry walked out at the porch into the iron noon on her husband's arm, because the form required it, and felt the arm under her hand as stiff and as far from her as the dale wall. Her father had been the curate of a poorer parish, 2 valleys over, a gentle scholar with more learning than living, dead a year now of the winter cough, and he had left his only child a Greek lexicon, a box of sermons in her own fair copying, £40, and no roof. An orphaned gentlewoman of 23 with £40 and no kin is a leaf the first hard wind takes, and the wind had come in the shape of an offer of marriage from Mr. Crispin Daventry of Rayfell, conveyed by his man of business, sudden and cold and complete, with a settlement on her of 100 a year for her life, whether the marriage prospered or no. She had not understood it. A gentleman of family does not send a stranger that offer to a curate's penniless orphan without a reason, and she had said as much, to his face, when he rode over to see her, and he had given her the reason without softening it. He meant to marry where his father would most mislike it, and quickly, before his father could prevent it, and a portionless parson's daughter chosen out of the next valley. But one was the surest stroke he could deal a proud man who had spent 29 years choosing everything for him. That was all she was to be. The stroke. He had said he would be no worse than just to her, that she should have the 100 a year, and the rank and the shelter of his name, and a separate part of his house to live in, and that he would ask nothing of her, and give her nothing of himself, and that if she could marry on those terms she might come, and if she could not, he would think none the worse of her and trouble her no more. She had looked at him a long moment then, a tall, grave-guarded man of 29, with his dead mother's grey eyes set in a face shut like a locked door, and a jaw kept so tight it was a labour to him to be civil, and she had not seen the cruelty she looked for. She had seen a man in pain who had made up his mind to do a cold thing and be honest about it, which is a rarer thing than kindness. and she had thought of the coming winter, and the £40, and the box of her father's sermons that nobody would ever buy, and she had said, yes. So she came to Rayfell, a wife and a stranger, on the hardest day of that hard January, in a hired chaise behind her husband's horse, 11 miles up a dale locked white from wall to wall, the river running black and narrow between shelves of blue ice, the fells gone up into low cloud on either hand, not a beast nor a soul abroad in all that frozen country. And at the head of it, on a high shelf of the fell side above the river, she saw the house she had married. It stood up tall and grey and forbidding against the white, a great square Jacobean pile of cold ashlar gone the colour of slate, 3 stories of mullioned windows ranked blank and dark, steep roofs and a row of tall chimneys, of which all but 2 stood smokeless, a walled forecourt of frost-cracked flags, a heavy iron-studded door under a weathered shield whose bearings had been hooded over with a board, so that the house owned no arms to the road. And she saw, even from the turn of the drive, that the place was lived in only by halves, that the west end of it showed a faint amber at 2 or 3 windows where a fire was, and that the whole long east wing of it stood shuttered and unlit and shut up, every pane of it furred a dead white, where the frost stood thick on the inside of the glass, as though that half of the house had been left to the winter on purpose, years since, and never taken back. She looked at the dark east wing as the chaise came up the drive, the way a person looks at the one closed door in a house that has been thrown open to her, and she did not yet know that everything she had married into was shut up behind it. The door was opened by an old butler, Hunderdale, white-headed and stiff and dry, who had been 40 years in the family, and had seen its whole long trouble, and said nothing of it to anyone. And behind him in the cold hall stood Mrs. Goodlake, come on ahead from the church, and 2 maids, and at the far dark end of the hall, lying square across the foot of a great shut-oak door that gave on the east, an old grey deerhound, very tall and gaunt and slow with his years, his muzzle gone white and his eyes gone cloudy, who lifted his head when the strangers came in and did not rise. Mrs. Goodlake said the dog was Tarn, the late mistress's own, who had been a young hound when she died and was an old one now, and who had lain across the foot of that east door every day of the 8 years since, though there was neither fire nor company nor any living soul behind it, and could not be coaxed for long to lie anywhere else. Marian crossed the cold flags and put her bare hand under the old grey jaw, and the hound leaned the weight of his head into her palm and held it there. And she stood a moment with the strange dog's head in her hand in her husband's freezing hall, and understood, without a word said, that whatever grief was shut up in this house, the dumb beast had kept its door longer and more faithfully than any Christian in it. Her husband had ridden ahead and was not in the hall. Mrs. Goodlake, with a housekeeper's flat kindness, took the new mistress up the west stair to the rooms made ready for her, a chamber and a small sitting room in the warmed west range, aired and fired 3 days against her coming, plain but decent, with a good fire and clean hangings, and her own meagre boxes already carried up, and said that the master kept to the library and his own rooms, and dined alone for the most part, and that the mistress should be served whenever and wherever she chose, and that the east wing was kept locked and was not gone into, and that the key of it was the master's own, and he carried it on himself, and that this was the way of the house, and had been these 8 years, and was not for a servant to explain. And having said the one thing that mattered in the flat voice of a woman saying it on purpose, she curtsied and left the bride to warm her hands at her own first fire. So Marian Stallybrass, that was, Marian Daventry that now is, sat by a fire in a cold house that did not want her, on her wedding night, with 100 a year settled on her and a husband under the same roof who had told her to her face he would give her nothing of himself. And she did not weep, for she had wept herself dry over her father a year since, and had little left for her own bargain, which she had made with her eyes open. She sat, and she thought, not of the husband, and not of the 100 a year, but of a thing her father had taught her in his cold study, when she was a girl helping him to his books, that the truth of any matter is written down somewhere by some honest hand if a person has the patience to find the page, and that the whole labour of a scholar is the patience to find the page. And she looked across the dark house in her mind, towards the one locked wing, and she did not yet know what was written there, but she knew already, the way she knew her father's hand, that something was. The first days at Rayfell were the cold civil days of two strangers under one roof, who have agreed not to trouble one another. Her husband kept his word to the letter. He was never unkind and never near. They met at dinner, when he dined at home, at the two ends of a long table in a cold dining parlour, and he asked after her comfort in a few level words, and saw that she had whatever the house could give, and spoke of the weather and the state of the road, and nothing nearer. And when the cloth was drawn, he bowed and went to his library and his own fire, and she went to hers, and the great house lay dark and silent between them, with its one wing locked. He rode out alone at first light every day she was there, along the frozen river or up onto the white fell, on a raw-boned grey horse, and came back at dusk with the cold set in his face, and she watched him from her window, go out and come back, and never once turn his head to the house, a man riding away from something every morning that was always there when he came home. She learned the shape of him slowly, from the servants and from her own watching, as a person learns a sick patient she may not question. She learned that he was 29 and had been master here but 5 years, since the old Sir Audland, his father, had quitted the place. That father and son had not spoken in all that time, nor in some years before it, that the quarrel between them was old and deep, and went back, the servants believed, to the death of the late mistress 8 years gone, though none of them rightly knew the heart of it, for it had been a quiet quarrel, the worst kind that makes no noise and never mends. She learned that he carried his dead mother's thin gold ring on his smallest finger and had never been heard to speak of her, that the east wing had been her own, and had been locked the day she was buried and never opened since, and that whatever lay between Crispin Daventry and his father, and between Crispin Daventry and the memory of his mother, it had frozen this whole half of a great house solid, 8 winters deep, and was freezing the man himself by inches before his servants' eyes, and they could do nothing. And now there was a wife who could do nothing either. She did not try, at the first, to do anything. She was a guest in all but name in a house of grief, and she had the sense to be quiet in it. She set her own small rooms in order, and unpacked her father's lexicon and her box of sermons and her writing case, and she made herself useful in the small ways a gentlewoman may, without being asked. She took the household books off Mrs. Goodlake's hands, who was glad of it, and found them honest but old-fashioned, and the stores running short for the dead of winter, and she ordered the larder and the still-room, with a hand schooled by years of doing much on little. She sat in the warm kitchen of an evening with the servants, because her own rooms were lonely, and theirs had the one good fire, and she heard, in their slow, guarded dale talk, more of the house's long trouble than anyone had meant to tell her, and she made a friend, the first she had made in that country, of the old hound Tarn, who left his post at the east door an hour each evening now to come and lie at her feet by the kitchen fire, and went stiffly back to it after. As a sentry goes back to a post, he will not quit for any kindness. And every day, going about the warm west of the house, she came in her mind against the locked east of it, the way the tongue comes against a broken tooth, and the thing worked in her, not as curiosity, which is idle, but as the scholar's patience her father had bred in her, which cannot rest while it knows a page is unread. It was the 3rd week, and a black, still night of hard frost, when she first stood at the foot of the great east door. She had not meant to. She had come down late for a book left in the cold hall with a single candle, and the old hound was lying across the threshold as he always lay, and he raised his head and looked at her, and then looked at the door, the way a dumb beast will turn its eyes on the thing it cannot say. And she stood there a long moment in the cold with the candle, looking at the locked door and the white-furred frost on the dark fanlight above it. And she heard, behind her, her husband's step. He had come down from the library, and he stopped at the edge of the hall and saw his wife standing with a candle at the foot of his mother's door, and the old guarded face shut harder, and he said in a voice gone quiet and dangerous and low that the east wing was not opened, that it was his and no one's else, and that he would take it as a kindness if she would not stand at that door. And Marian turned and looked at him across the cold flags in the small light, and did not flinch, because she had stood by deathbeds and was not easily frightened by a living man's grief, and she said only that she had not meant to trespass, that she had come for a book, and that she was sorry for whatever sorrow was behind the door, of which she knew nothing and asked nothing, and that he need not fear her. And then she said one thing more, quietly, because it was true and because someone in that house had to say a true thing to him at last. "You ride away from this house every morning," she said, "and it is always here when you come back. A locked door does not keep the cold out, sir. It only keeps it in." And she made him a small curtsy and took up her candle and her book, and went up the west stair to her own fire, and left him standing in the dark hall with the old hound and the shut door. And she did not know, going up, that he stood there a long while after she was gone, looking at the door she had named, with his mother's ring cold on his finger. She thought she had angered him past mending, and that the cold civility between them would freeze to a cold silence. But the next morning at breakfast, which he did not commonly take with her, Crispin Daventry came into the small parlour where she sat alone over her tea, and stood a moment, and then said stiffly, looking not at her but at the frost on the window, that he had been ungentle to her in the hall, and was ashamed of it, that she was a stranger he had used hardly to serve a turn of his own, and had no part in his quarrels, and deserved better usage in his house than to be spoken to so, and that he begged her pardon. It cost him a great deal. She could see what it cost him, and she answered him gently and made it easy, and offered him tea, and he sat and took it, the first meal he had ever willingly shared with her, the two of them at the small table in the grey winter light, with the frost on the panes, and they spoke a little for the first time of nothing in particular, and it was not cold. It was the smallest thaw, and neither of them named it. But after that morning he sometimes took his breakfast with her, and sometimes when he came in frozen from his ride, he stood a quarter hour at her fire, instead of going straight to his own, and she found, drawing him out by inches as she had drawn the old hound, that there was under the locked and guarded man a starved kindness and a quick, grave mind and a great unhealed wound, and that the wound had a shape, though he never came near to naming it. It had to do with his mother, and with his father, and with the 8 years' silence, and with something he believed of one of them that had set the iron in him. And she came to see that he did not hate his mother's memory, as she had first half thought from the turned house, but rather could not bear it, which is a different and a heavier thing, and that the not bearing of it was the cold at the heart of Raphael. She did not press him. She was learning him, as she learned all things with patience, and she was learning the house too, and it was the house that opened the door at last, and not the man. It was a wild night at the very end of January, the worst of that winter, a north wind off the fell driving fine snow against the east face of the house all the dark hours, and in the morning Mrs. Goodlake came to the mistress white and flustered, that the storm in the night had brought down a slate or a sill somewhere along the shut east wing, for there was a draught now where no draught had been, and a powdering of snow lying inside the cold corridor under the door, and that water would get to the old rooms and the floors, and the master's late mother's things if the broken place were not found and stopped, and that she dared not send a maid into the locked wing, nor go herself, and that the master was 3 hours gone on the fell, and not looked for till dusk. And what was the mistress's pleasure? The mistress's pleasure was plain to her in a moment, though she kept it from her face. A house was taking harm, a thing must be done, the master was from home, and behind the locked door that must now, of necessity and for the house's sake, be opened, lay the unread page she had felt under her hand these 3 weeks. She said, in her quiet way, that of course the broken place must be found and stopped before the snow did its mischief, and that she would go herself, since the master was abroad and the thing would not wait, and that Mrs. Goodlake should fetch the spare key. There was a spare key. Of course there was a spare key. Old houses keep a duplicate of every lock in a press in the steward's room, and the late mistress's wing was no exception, only that no one in 8 years had been let take it down. Mrs. Goodlake fetched it, an old long iron key red with rust, and gave it into the mistress's hand with the air of a woman handing over something half sacred and half feared, and Marian took a candle and a shawl and the old key, and the old hound, Tarn, rose up stiff from the threshold as she came to it, and stood, and pressed close against her skirts, and went in with her when she turned the rusted lock and pushed the cold door open on its stiff hinges for the first time in 8 years. He had kept the door 8 years for his mistress. And now he went in. The cold beyond the door was a different cold, a still dead cellar cold that had stood undisturbed since a coffin went out of it, and the corridor ran away before her blue, dark and silent, the small snow lying along it under a broken pane far down, and on either hand the shapes of shrouded furniture stood under grey holland like sleepers, and the frost stood thick as fern on the inside of every window, and the dust lay even and grey on the floor, save where the old dog's feet and her own now broke it. She found the broken place first, for the house's sake, before she let herself look at anything else. A casement burst at its old lead by the storm halfway down the wing, the snow blown in across a window seat, and she did the practical thing, propped the casement to, and wadded the broken light with a holland sheet pulled from a chair, and stopped the draught and the snow, as well as it could be stopped till a man could mend it, so that whatever else she did that morning, the errand that justified her was honestly done. And then, the housemaid safe, she let herself go on, down the cold corridor, with the candle and the dog, to the room at the very end, which she knew before she came to it was the one, for the old hound went ahead of her now, stiff and sure, straight down the wing to a particular door, and lay down across the foot of it, and looked up at her, his whole long faithfulness in his clouded eyes. And she lifted the latch and went in. It was a small room, and it had been a woman's. There was a narrow daybed under holland by a window furred white with frost, where a sick woman might have lain to catch the low winter sun, a small rosewood writing table, a dead hearth choked with the cold soot of 8 winters, and on the wall over the daybed a portrait in a gilt frame, turned face to the wall, so that only its grey backing and the cord showed. The whole room stood as a room stands that someone has been carried out of and no one has come back into. The daybed made, the table dusted once and never since. A glass on the sill that had held flowers and held now only a brown ring of long-dried water and the ghost of a stem. It was the saddest room she had ever stood in, and she had stood in many sad rooms, and she set her candle on the rosewood table and stood a moment in the cold and the dust and the held breath of it, and then she did the 2 things she had come, in her heart, to do. She turned the portrait first. She lifted it down, gently, with both hands, and turned it to the grey light, and saw a fair, gentle woman of perhaps 30 seated with a sprig of snowdrops in one hand and an infant son upon her knee, ash-fair hair and large grey eyes, her husband's grey eyes, exactly his, set in a sweet, patient, sorrowing face. And Marian knew, without being told, that she looked at the late mistress of Rayfell, the mother who had been locked up with this wing 8 years, the woman whose son could not bear her memory and would not say why, and she stood the portrait up against the wall so that it faced the room, the right way, for the first time since the woman died. And then she came to the writing table. The shallow centre drawer was locked. It was the only locked thing in that whole open ruin of a room, and a locked drawer in a dead woman's table, in a wing her son had shut against the world, was the page Marian had felt under her hand since the day she came. And she did the patient scholar's thing, and did not force it, but felt under the table edge and along the dusty ledge of the press behind, and found, where a careful gentlewoman would have left it, a small key on a faded ribbon, hung on a nail behind the writing table where a sick woman propped in that daybed could have reached it, and no searcher hurrying through would think to look, and she took it down and fitted it and turned the lock and drew out the drawer. There was one thing in it, a small calf-bound book, a diary. The boards warped and the brown calf bloomed white at the edges where 8 winters of damp and frost had got into it, tied round with a thin ribbon gone grey. She lifted it out, and it was cold and a little stiff in her hands, the frost gone into the very pages, and she untied the ribbon and opened it under her candle in the dead room, and saw it was written close in a fine failing woman's hand, and that every entry was dated, day by day and month by month, in the clear, careful way of a person who set great store by setting down the truth of a thing on the day it happened, so that no one after could mistake the order of it. And she saw, on the first leaf, in that same hand, a line that stopped her breath in the cold. For my son Crispin, who will one day open this room, and who must not be let believe the lie, till he is old enough to bear the truth. C.D. Marian Daventry sat down slowly on the holland-covered daybed with her dead mother-in-law's frost-stained diary open in her lap, in the cold room at the end of the locked wing, with the old hound's head come to rest on her foot and the candle burning between the frost-furred window and the portrait now facing the room at last. And she began, in the grey light of that bitter morning, to read the truth that a dying woman had written down 8 years before, for the very hand that now held it, and so to learn at last the shape of the cold at the heart of Rayfell, and the name of the man who had made it. She read it as her father had taught her to read a hard text, slowly, in order, trusting the dates, taking nothing on a single line that the whole did not bear out, and the whole bore it out. The diary began some 3 years before the writer's death, in a fair, untroubled hand, the small record of a gentlewoman's days in a great house, the garden, the weather, her boys' lessons, her husband's comings and goings, and Sir Audland, her husband, stood in those early pages, a hot, proud, hasty man, quick to anger and quick to trust where he had once given his trust, but no monster. A man who loved his wife and his son in his stiff fashion and was easily worked upon by any hand he believed honest, and the hand he believed honest above all others, the diary showed, page after early page, was the hand of his man of business and the steward of all his affairs. A smooth, confiding gentleman named Mr. Osric Bellingham, who had the keeping of the rents and the accounts and the letters of the whole estate, and the ear of the master in everything, and the run of both the great houses the family then held, this Rayfell in the Dale, and an older seat away south. A man, the early entries said warmly enough, that the family had trusted 30 years and used like a friend. Then, by the dates, a trouble came into the house, and the writer set it down as it came, not knowing the end of it, which is the surest kind of witness. There was money gone wrong in the estate. Rents not come in, that should have come in. A mortgage on the southern seat that the master had never knowingly raised. Sums paid away on the master's hand to people the mistress had never heard of. And Sir Odland, hot and proud and ashamed to be thought a poor manager of his own, had grown strange and angry and close, and had begun to believe, because Mr. Bellingham, his trusted steward, gently and sorrowfully led him day by day to believe it, that the leak in his fortune was nearer home than any steward, that it was his own wife who was bleeding him, sending money privately to a brother of hers gone for a wastrel to the Indies, deceiving her husband behind his back. It was a lie. The diary, dated and particular, showed it a lie from the inside, the way only the wronged person can show it. The mistress had no brother in the Indies. The one brother she had was a country parson dead these 10 years. She had sent no money anywhere. She had not the keeping of so much as the still-room accounts, let alone the rents. But she was a gentle woman, and not a worldly one. And her husband was proud, and would not be questioned. And between them stood the smooth steward, Mr. Bellingham, carrying every word from one to the other, and carrying them false. And the diary, in entry after dated entry, showed the writer slowly coming to understand, too late and too gentle to save herself, the thing that was being done, that it was Bellingham himself who was robbing the estate, who had raised the mortgage with a forged hand and taken the rents and paid the money away to himself through 100 small false names, and that he was covering his long theft, surely and patiently, by turning the proud husband against the innocent wife, so that when the loss came at last to light, as it must, the blame should be ready-made and fall on her, a dead woman by then very likely, and never on the trusted steward of 30 years. She had found him out, the diary said, by the dull patient means a quiet woman has, by keeping, in this very book, the dates and the figures she could come at, the day a rent was due and the day it was not paid, the sum the steward said was spent, and the thing it was said to be spent on that she knew had never been bought, and she had set it all down, dated, in her own hand, meaning to lay it before her husband when she had proof enough to break the steward's hold on his ear. And then she had fallen ill, a wasting illness of the chest, the kind that takes a winter to do its work. And as she lay dying in this very room, propped in this daybed at this frost-furred window, she had seen, the last entry said, that she would not live to lay her proof before her husband, that the steward had only to wait now for her death to be rid of his one accuser, and leave his lie standing over her grave forever. And so she had done the only thing left to a dying woman with the truth in her hand, and no time to be heard. She had written it all out, fair and full and dated, in this book, and locked it in this drawer, and left the key where her own hand could reach it, and no other would look, and prayed, in the last lines, that her son Crispin, when he was grown and the room was opened, should find it and read it, and know that his mother had died falsely accused, and clear her name, and have a care of the smooth man who had done it. The last entry was dated 9 days before the writer died. It was short, the hand very weak. It said that she had asked to see her husband that morning, and he had not come, being still cold with her over the lie, that she had asked then for her son, and the boy had come and sat by her an hour, a grave child of 21, just down from his studies, and that she had not laid the truth on him, for he was too young and too hot, and would have flown at his father or the steward, and ruined himself and proved nothing. That she had only kissed him, and bid him remember she had loved him and his father both, and keep her ring, and one day open her room. And that she had given the truth to this book instead, where it would keep, for the book could not be made to lie, nor to flinch, nor to die before its time, and would say the same thing in 10 years that it said now, when there should be a calmer hand to read it. I am content to leave it so, the dying woman had written in the last legible line. I shall not be believed living. Let me be believed written, when my boy is grown, and let the one who reads this clear me. Cecily Daventry. Marian closed the cold book and sat a long while in the dead room, with it shut in her 2 hands, and the candle burned down, and the old hound slept on her foot, and the portrait of the gentle, grey-eyed woman faced the room from the wall, and she understood now the whole of the cold at Rayfell and the shape of the wound in the man she had married, in one piece, the way she sometimes understood the whole sense of a hard passage when the last word of it gave her the key. She understood that the boy of 21 had grown to the man of 29, believing the lie his mother had died under. Not believing her wholly guilty, perhaps, but never knowing her wholly innocent, which is its own slow poison. That the ruin had come to light after her death, as it was bound to, the mortgage and the missing rents and the wreck of the southern seat which had to be sold, that the smooth steward had ridden the storm out exactly as he had planned, the blame all laid by then on the convenient dead wife who had sent it to her brother, and the trusted Mr. Bellingham passing on, sorrowful and unsuspected, to serve the family still in what was left to it. That the proud father, ruined and shamed and grieving and believing himself betrayed by his own wife, had quarrelled past mending with the son who would not quite hate her memory as he did, and had quitted Rayfell and left it to that son and never spoken to him since. And that the son, master of a half-ruined house at 24, with a dead mother he could not clear, and could not condemn, and could not bear, and a living father he could not forgive and could not reach, had locked the room she died in, and the truth he did not know was in it, and frozen the whole east of his life around it, and grown cold to the bone, and had married at the last a parson's penniless daughter, not for spite alone, she saw now, but because a man frozen that hard wants to deal one warm blow of his own at the proud father who had chosen all his life for him, and a defiant marriage was the only blow left him to deal. And she understood, last and most, holding the cold diary, that the dying woman had been right, that she was believed written. For here in Marian's hands was the calm later hand the dying mother had prayed for, 8 years on, a daughter-in-law she could never have foreseen, reading the dated truth in the cold room exactly as it had been left to be read. And the truth had kept, as the writer said it would, and was as good and as deadly to the smooth steward this bitter morning as it had been the day it was set down, and better, for now there was someone to carry it out of the locked room and lay it where it would do its work. But she saw too, sitting there, that the carrying of it would want as much care as the finding had wanted patience. She could not simply run to her husband with the book. He was a hot, grave-wounded man who had believed a thing about his mother for 8 years. To fling the whole truth at him raw was to risk his flying at the steward, or his father half-cocked, as his mother had feared he would as a boy, and proving nothing, and perhaps being himself undone. And the truth must not only be told, it must be proved, and proved against a smooth, clever man of 30 years' trust, who would deny it to the last, and call a dead woman's private book a sick woman's fancy, exactly as he had no doubt always reckoned anyone would, if ever the book came to light at all. The diary alone, the writer herself had known, was a wronged woman's word against a trusted man's. It would want more. It would want the figures in it checked against the estate's own accounts that Bellingham himself had kept, to show where his books and her dated entries disagreed, and his hand had lied. It would want, if such a man yet lived, some honest third witness to the writer's mind in her last illness, and it would want to be sprung, not in a private rage, but in a cold reckoning, before witnesses, where the smooth man could not wriggle, and the proud father, if he could be brought, must hear his dead wife cleared in his own ears. She locked the diary back in the drawer where she had found it, and hung the small K again on its nail, and left the room as she had found it, save that the portrait faced the wall no longer, and she came out of the cold wing with the old hound, and locked the great east door behind her, and gave the rusted key back to Mrs. Goodlake with a steady face and the true word that the broken casement was stopped and the house safe, and she went up to her own fire and sat down to think, with the whole cold truth of Rayfell in her head, and not one soul yet to share it, and began, in the patient way her father had bred in her, to plan how a thing 8 years buried might be brought up into the light, and proved, and made to clear the dead and shame the living, before ever she said a word of it to the wounded man whose mother it would give him back. If you have ever held in your own 2 hands a truth that could mend or break a household, and known that the whole of it turned not on the truth but on the patience to prove it, you will know the long, quiet labour Marian set herself that February, and you are warmly welcome to stay by this hearth and see how she did it, and if you would not lose the thread of how a cold house was thawed by a dead woman's hand, you may follow this telling so it finds you again, and I shall be glad of your company to the end. She began with the figures, because the figures could be checked without a word to anyone, and because a wronged woman's word turned to proof the moment it could be laid beside the wrongdoer's own books and shown to disagree. She had the household and estate accounts in her keeping already, or could come at them, for she had quietly taken the running of the house, and no one thought it strange now that the mistress should sit of an evening over ledgers. And she got from old Hunderdale, who kept the muniment room, the old estate books of the years the diary covered, the rent rolls and the steward's account books of Mr. Bellingham's own keeping, on the plain pretext that a new mistress ought to understand the long state of the family's affairs. And she sat up by her candle, night upon night, with the cold diary open on one hand and the steward's fair ledgers open on the other, and did the slow, exact work she was made for. She set the dead woman's dated entries against the steward's dated entries, day for day, and sum for sum, the way her father had set a doubtful text against a true one to find where a copyist's hand had slipped a lie into Holy Writ, and the lies were there, where the diary said they would be, where Lady Cecily had written on a given day that a certain half-year's rent of the southern farms, £240, had come into the steward's hand, for she had seen the tenants pay and had the figure from the bailiff's own mouth. The steward's ledger for that same day showed but £90 received, the rest set down as abated for distress and arrears uncollected, £150 quietly written off on paper that the diary swore had been paid in coin. Where the diary named a sum the master was told had gone to re-roof a barn, the ledger carried the sum, but the barn, the bailiff would still bear witness, had never been touched, and running through it all, the mortgage on the southern seat, raised, the ledger said, by Sir Audlin's own order and hand for his own needs, but the diary, dated and certain, swore that the master had ordered no such thing, and that the deed must be forged, for she had been in his confidence enough to know he would have told her, lie or no lie between them, before he mortgaged his father's land. The diary could not, alone, prove the deed forged, but it could point, dated, at the very season and sum. And a forged signature, once a man knows where to look and has cause to doubt it, will not always stand a careful eye and an honest lawyer's. By the end of that work, Marian had, set out fair in her own hand on clean sheets, a schedule of 12 and more places where the steward's own books, kept in his own hand, disagreed with the dead woman's dated record. Every one of them a sum that had gone astray, every one of them covered on paper by a false reason, every false reason in Bellingham's writing, and the sum of the dozen, footed up, came near enough to the whole loss that had wrecked the southern seat and ruined the master and been laid at the dead wife's door. It was not yet proof a court would hang on. But it was the dead woman's word, no longer alone. It was her word, dated, backed by the wrongdoer's own pen caught contradicting her. And that is a very different and a far stronger thing, and Marian knew it for the spine of a case. She wanted next a living witness, if one could be found, to the mind and the innocence of the dying woman, someone the world would believe who had been near her at the end and was no kin and had no axe, and the diary, read close, gave her one. For Lady Cecily had named, in the entries of her last illness, the physician who attended her, a Dr. Skirrow of the market town down the dale, who had come up twice a week to her through that last winter. And she had set down, on more than one date, that she had spoken to Dr. Skirrow plainly of her trouble, not the whole of the proof, for she would lay that only before her husband, but the heart of it, that she was falsely accused of robbing her own house, that she knew who did the robbing, and that she feared she would die before she could clear herself. Marian made a quiet errand into the town. The first time she had left Rayfell since she came to it, driven down on a clear, hard day on the pretext of the mistress's own marketing. And she sought out old Dr. Skirrow, a blunt, grey country physician near 70 now, and she did not at first tell him all, but asked him, as the new mistress of Rayfell, whether he remembered attending the late Lady Cecily Daventry in her last illness, and the old man's face changed, and he said that he remembered it as he remembered few cases of 40 years, for it had grieved him, that the poor lady had died as much of a broken heart as of her lungs, that she had told him, again and again, lucid to the last and no more wandering than he was himself, that she was wronged and falsely blamed and knew the hand that did it, and had begged him to remember she had said so, and that he had remembered it all these years, and had thought it a great pity and a great wrong, but had been a plain physician with no proof and no standing to meddle in a great family's griefs, and had held his peace, and was not easy in his mind that he had. And when Marian asked him, lo, whether he would say all that again, on his oath, before witnesses, if a way were found to clear the lady at last, the old man looked at her a long moment, and said that he would say it before the king if it would clear that gentle soul's name, and had waited 8 years for someone to ask him. She had her second witness then, living and willing and beyond suspicion. And now she wanted the third thing, which was the hardest, for it was not a paper nor a person but a man's heart. She must bring her husband to the truth without breaking him on it, and she must do it before she sprang the rest, for she would not clear his mother behind his back, nor have him learn it last of all in a room full of strangers. The diary was for him first, but he could not be handed it cold. She watched her chance through that thawing and freezing tale of the winter, drawing nearer to him by the small fireside inches they had won, until there came a still grey Sunday evening when he sat with her later than his wont by her fire, the two of them quiet over a book, and she saw the guard down in his face as far as she had ever seen it, and she judged the hour was come. She told him first, not of the diary, but of his mother, gently, sidelong, the way you bring a frozen hand to warmth slowly so the pain does not master it. She said that she had been into the east wing the day of the storm, to stop the broken casement, which he knew, for she had told him so, and that she had turned his mother's portrait to face the room and asked his pardon if she had done wrong, but that she had not been able to bear so sweet a face left to the wall. And she watched him, and the old shut look came down, and he said low, that the portrait was no matter, that the room was no matter, that his mother— and there he stopped, the way he always stopped, on the edge of the thing he could not say. And Marian very quietly said the unsayable thing for him, to spare him the saying of it. You believe she wronged your father. You have believed it since you were a boy, and you have never been able either to forgive her or to stop loving her, and it has frozen you, and this house, for 8 years. And he looked at her, white as a man looks who hears his deepest wound named aloud by another for the first time in his life, and he did not deny it. And into that bare silence, gently, she laid the thing she had carried for him 3 weeks, that she had found in a locked drawer of the writing table in that room, a book his mother had kept, that it was a diary, dated, in his mother's own hand, that it had been left there, locked, with his name written in it, for him to find when the room was opened and he was grown, and that she had read it, for the house's sake and his, and that it did not say what he had believed these 8 years. It said the opposite. And she went and fetched it from where she had brought it up at last, and kept it ready. And she put his dead mother's frost-stained diary into his hands by her own fireside, and opened it to the first leaf, to the line that was written to him, and she stood back and let him read. She did not watch his face after the first moment. It was not a thing to be watched. She went and stood at the dark window with her back to him, and looked out at the frozen river under the moon, and gave him the only privacy her presence could, and let him read his mother's hand in the firelight at his own pace, the dated truth of the lie, and the steward and the wrong, and the dying woman's love, and her trust in the son who would one day open the room. And the room was quiet a long while, but for the fire and the turning of the cold, stiff leaves, and once, behind her, she heard the sound a strong man makes who has not wept in many years, and weeps now. And she did not turn, but stood at the window with her own eyes wet, for the gentle woman in the portrait, and the frozen man by the fire, until it was quiet again. When at last he spoke, his voice was not the cold, level voice she had married, but a younger and a broken and a thawed one, and he said only, the first thing, the boy's thing, she did not do it. All this while, she did not do it, and I let myself half believe she did, and Marian came and sat by him, near now, and said gently, no, she did not do it, and he had been a boy, and had been lied to by a man his whole house trusted, and the shame was the liar's and not his, and he sat with the open book on his knee, and his mother's 8 years locked truth in his hands, and the iron that had been in him since he was 21, went out of him by the fire that night, not all at once, but it went, and somewhere in the long, low talk that followed, the clearing of 8 years between two people who had married as strangers and were strangers no longer, the cold thing at the heart of Raphael quietly broke and began to run. He would have gone to Bellingham the next morning and struck him down, or to his father the next day and flung the book before him, and it was Marian, calm where he was aflame, who held him to the patient road, as his mother in the diary had foreseen that someone one day must. She showed him the schedule she had drawn, the steward's own ledgers caught lying against the dated diary. She told him of Dr. Skirrow waiting in the town with 8 years' held testimony, and she said that a smooth man of 30 years' trust was not to be brought down by a son's rage nor a private accusation, which he would meet with sorrowful denials and the old slander of the sick, fanciful dead wife, but only by a cold reckoning, the proofs laid out in order before witnesses too weighty to be brushed aside, and, if it could by any means be done, before Sir Audland himself, the one man in the world the lie had most deceived and most need now, hear it broken. For the clearing of the dead lady would be but half a clearing, if her husband, who had believed her false and quarrelled to his grave's edge over it, were not there to hear her cleared and to know, before he died, what and whom he had truly lost. And Crispin Daventry, who in 8 years had not been able to bring himself to write one line to his father, sat down at his wife's word and wrote one now. A short letter, stiff and hard to write, that said only that a matter had come to light touching his late mother's memory and the long ruin of their house, that it was not what either of them had believed, that there was proof, and that he begged his father, by whatever was left between them, to come to Rayfell on a day named and hear it, and to suffer Mr. Bellingham, who still served him, to be asked to attend on a question of the old accounts, without being told why. It was a thin chance that the proud old man would come, and a thinner one that the smooth steward, all unknowing, would walk up the dale into the room where his 30-year lie was laid ready to be broken. But the letter to the father was so unlike anything the son had sent in 8 years that it pierced even Sir Ordland's pride, and the request to the steward was so ordinary, a question of old accounts, the new young master finding his feet, would Mr. Bellingham oblige, that it raised no alarm in a man grown easy in a lie, no living soul had ever questioned. Word came back that Sir Ordland would come, and word came back, smooth and obliging, that Mr. Bellingham would be most happy to wait upon the young master and clear up any little difficulty in the old books, as he had served the family man and boy these 30 years, and asked nothing better than to be of use. And so, the reckoning was set, for a grey, still day in the first week of March, at Rayfell, in the library, with the thaw just coming into the dale and the snowdrops, that Lady Cecily had loved and held in her portrait, breaking through at last along the cold edge of the orchard wall. Marian made the room ready herself, the morning of it, as her late mother-in-law would have understood. She had the great library fire built up, the long table cleared and set, and laid out upon it in the order they would be wanted. The dead woman's diary, the schedule of the lying accounts in her own fair hand, and the old estate ledgers of the steward's keeping, open at the marked and dated pages. And she set out chairs, and saw that there should be witnesses of weight, for proof shown to no one proves nothing. The Reverend Mr. Quaintance, who had married her and buried her father, and christened, long ago, the boy in the portrait, came as a witness of standing in the dale. Old Dr. Skirrow drove up from the town with his 8 years' testimony at last to be spoken. Hunderdale, the old butler, who had served the house through the whole of its trouble, and known the late mistress's innocence in his dumb servant's heart without ever the power to prove it, stood by the door, and at the table's head sat Crispin Daventry, no longer cold but very pale and still, with his dead mother's ring on his hand and his wife at his side. And the old greyhound Tarn, who had kept the dead woman's door 8 years, came in of his own accord and lay down across the library threshold, as if he too were a witness, the oldest and the most faithful, come to see his long watch-out. Sir Ordland Daventry came up the dale first, in a travelling chaise, a proud, broken-looking old man of 63, white and stiff and grey in the face, who had ruined and exiled and grieved himself old in 8 years of believing the wrong thing. And he came into the house, he had quitted with his hat in his hand, and his pride held before him like a shield, and looked at the grown son he had not seen in 5 years, and the two of them, father and son, stood a moment in the cold hall, with 8 years of silence between them, and could not speak. And Marian, who had no part in their quarrel and so could cross it, came forward and curtsied to the old man, and named herself his son's wife, and bid him welcome to Rayfell in a plain, gentle voice, and got him by that small courtesy into the warm library, and into a chair, where the proofs lay ready on the table he had once sat at as master, and where he should, within the hour, hear his dead wife's name made clean. The steward came last, as the guilty so often come, easy and unsuspecting and a little late, his chaise turning up the thawing drive at noon, Mr. Osric Bellingham, a smooth, well-fed, plausible gentleman of 58 in a good snuff-coloured coat and a heavy seal-ring, with a low, confiding, pleasant manner and pale, close-set eyes that missed nothing, and were not quite so easy after they had gone round the full room as before they had. For he had looked to wait on a green young master over a column of figures, and he found instead a fire built up and a long table laid with books and a company gathered, the old physician, the parson, the butler at the door, the new wife by her husband, and, in the master's old chair, white and grim, the one man in England Bellingham had most reason in the world not to wish to meet across a table of accounts, Sir Audland himself. The smooth man checked one half instant in the doorway, the close-set eyes counting the room, and then 30 years of plausibility closed smooth over the check, and he came in, bowing, and was sorry to have kept the company, and was wholly at the young master's service in any little matter of the old books, and made, to Sir Audland, a particular low, sorrowful bow, the bow of a faithful servant, grieved to see his old master so aged. It was Crispin who should by rights have opened it, for it was his house and his mother. But it was his wife's hand that had built the case, and the dead woman in the diary had prayed for a calm later hand to lay the truth out plain, and so it was agreed between them, against his hot wish, that Marian should set out the 3 matters in order, cold and exact, as she alone could, and that he should sit by and hold his peace until the proofs had done their work, which is harder than any speaking. So when the company was seated, and Mr. Bellingham had been given the chair set ready opposite the laid table, and had folded his smooth white hands upon it with the easy patience of a man waiting to be helpful, Marian Daventry rose in her plain grey gown at the head of the table, with her late mother-in-law's diary under her hand, and asked the leave of the room to lay before it 3 matters touching the old accounts of the estate, and the memory of the late Lady Cecily Daventry, and to beg that each be looked at in its turn before any word was said. And Sir Audland, hearing his dead wife's name, went rigid in his chair, and Mr. Bellingham's pale eyes rested on the cold, warped book under the young wife's hand and grew, for the first time, attentive. The first matter, Marian said, in the plain, steady voice her father had bred in her over many a hard text, is this book. It is the private diary of the late Lady Cecily Daventry, kept in her own hand in the last years of her life, dated day by day, and locked by her own hand in the writing table of the room she died in the east wing of this house, which has stood locked these 8 years, and was opened in January last to stop a casement broken in the storm. I found the book then. It bears on its first leaf, in her hand, a direction that it was left for her son to find and read when the room should be opened and he was grown. He has read it. I shall read to this room what she wrote, not after her death, when she could have shaped it, but year by year and day by day, as the thing befell, in the ordinary keeping of her life, when she could not have known who would one day be sitting at this table to hear it. And she read. She read the early, untroubled pages, that the room might know the writer for what she was, a gentle, truthful woman with no malice and no cause. And then she read, dated and slow, the coming of the trouble. The rent's gone astray, the mortgage the master never knowingly raised, the money paid away on his hand to names his wife had never heard. And then she read the heart of it, the dying woman's dated discovery, that it was not she who robbed the house, that she had no brother in the Indies and had sent no money anywhere, that the leak was the steward's own hand, that Mr. Osric Bellingham was robbing the estate and covering his theft by turning her husband against her, so that the blame should fall on a dead wife and never on a trusted servant. She read it plainly, naming him from the page as the dead woman had named him, and she did not raise her voice. And as she read, the smooth colour drained slowly out of Mr. Bellingham's well-fed face, from the jaw upward, and his pale eyes stopped their easy travelling and fixed on the book, and his smooth white hands drew in off the open table to its edge. But he was a man of 30 years' practice in a lie, and he held, and when she paused he said, low and sorrowful and reasonable, the very thing she had known he would say. "A sad book," he said gently, shaking his head, "a very sad book, and a sadder proof of how that poor lady's mind was clouded at the last by her illness. God rest her. I knew her well, and loved her as we all did, and grieved to see so good a lady so worn down and fanciful at the end, that she fixed on the faithfulest servant of the house the very crime that was draining it. Sick fancies, madam, the wanderings of a dying woman who must lay her trouble somewhere. It is cruel to her memory to read them out. They prove nothing but how ill she was." And he looked, sorrowful and steady, to Sir Audland, who had heard exactly this slander of his wife's clouded mind for 8 years and half believed it still, and who sat grey and torn in his chair, not knowing yet which of them to believe. "They are not the wanderings of a clouded mind," Marian said, "and I will show this room that they are not, by something a sick fancy cannot do, for I come to the second matter." And she laid her hand on the old estate ledgers, open at their marked pages, in Bellingham's own keeping and his own writing, and on the fair schedule she had drawn beside them. "These are the estate's own account books of those same years, kept and written by Mr. Bellingham's own hand. And here, set against the diary day for day, is what they show. My late mother-in-law wrote, on a certain dated day, that a half-year's rent of the southern farms, £240, was paid in to the steward's hand. She had it from the tenants and the bailiff. Mr. Bellingham's own ledger, on that same day, in his own hand, owns to £90 received, and writes off the rest as abated and uncollected. £150 gone, on paper, that was paid in coin. She wrote that a sum was said to have re-roofed a barn that was never touched. His ledger carries the sum, and the bailiff will swear the barn stood untouched. And so down a dozen entries and more, every one a sum gone astray, every one covered in his writing by a false reason, and the dozen footed up the very ruin that was laid at her door. A dying woman's fancy, Mr. Bellingham, does not know to the day and the shilling where a living steward's own books would have to lie to hide his theft. She did not imagine these. She caught you in them, dated while she lived, and your own hand, kept these 8 years in this muniment room, bears her out against you, line by line today. The room was very still. The thaw dripped from the eaves beyond the window into the quiet. Sir Audland had risen half out of his chair and was staring at the open ledgers in his old servant's hand, and the grey torn look in his face was changing, slowly, terribly, into something else, as a man's face changes who is being shown that the thing he ruined, his life and his marriage believing, was a lie laid on him on purpose. And Mr. Bellingham's smooth front cracked at last. The pale eyes went from the ledgers to the diary, to the old physician, to the grim son, to the rising master, counting his ruin now and not his advantage, and he said, no longer quite so gently, that an old account book might be misread by an inexpert eye, that abatements and arrears were the common stuff of any estate in hard years, that a row of figures proved nothing of intent against a servant of 30 years' faithful standing, and that he would not sit to be accused on the strength of a sick woman's diary and a young lady's reckoning of books she did not understand. Then I come to the third matter, Marian said, which is neither a book nor a ledger, but a living man. And she turned to old Dr. Skirrow, where he sat by the fire, and asked him before the room whether he had attended the late Lady Cecily Daventry in her last illness, and whether her mind had been clouded or clear, and what she had said to him. And the blunt old country physician rose and looked full at Mr. Bellingham, and said, in the flat, hard voice of a man easing a burden he had carried 8 years, that he had attended the lady twice a week through the whole of her last winter, that her mind was as clear to her dying day as his own was now, no more wandering than the parsons there, that she had told him, again and again, lucid and grieving, that she was falsely accused of robbing her own house, that she knew the hand that truly robbed it, and that she feared she would die before she could clear herself, that he had believed her then and believed her now, and had thought it the cruelest wrong he had seen in 40 years of practice, and that he would swear to every word of it on his oath in any court in England, and had waited 8 years, with a heavy conscience, for someone to ask him. Her mind was not clouded, sir, the old man said, straight at the steward. It was clearer than yours, that has carried these 8 years. She knew what was done to her. So now do we all. And that was the end of Mr. Osric Bellingham. The diary had named him. His own ledgers had convicted his hand. And now a physician of unshaken standing, no kin and no interest, had sworn the dead woman sane and certain in her accusation. And the three together, the dated record and the lying books and the living oath, were a wall the smooth man could not get round, and he knew it, sitting there grey and fixed with his white hands closed on the table edge, and the whole easy plausibility gone out of his face like warmth out of a dead grate. He looked once at Sir Audland, for he had ruled that proud mind 30 years, and reached by old habit for it still. But Sir Audland was on his feet now, shaking, staring at his old servant, with the dawn of the whole truth breaking dreadful over his face, that this smooth man had robbed him, and to cover it had poisoned him against the gentle wife he loved, and let her die falsely blamed, and stood by sorrowing at the graveside of the woman his lie had killed, and gone on eating the family's bread, and serving the broken son for 8 years after, secure in the lie. And the old man's grief and rage and shame at 8 wasted years came up in him all at once, and it was not the steward who broke the silence, but the master, in a terrible low voice, asking his servant of 30 years whether it was true. And Mr. Bellingham, with the room walled against him, and the proofs cold on the table, and his old dupe risen against him at last, did the thing such men do when the long lie is broken past mending, and there is nothing left to be got by holding it. He let it go. He did not confess so much as collapse, the smooth front falling all at once into a grey, shapeless fright, and he said, low, not looking at any of them, that he had never meant the lady to die under it, that he had taken the money. Yes, a little at first, that he meant to put back, and then more, and then it was past putting back and only to be hidden, and that when the loss began to show, he had needed it laid somewhere away from himself, and she was the easiest and the safest place. A quiet, unworldly woman the proud master could be brought to doubt, and that he had never thought she would take it so to heart as to sicken on it, nor reckoned she had wit to keep a book against him, nor ever dreamed the locked room would give it up after he had thought himself 8 years safe. I'd not have had her die of it, he said, grey and small and ruined, the plausibility all gone. But she was the soft place in the wall, and a man covers himself where the wall is soft. God forgive me. I knew she was innocent the while. I knew it, and I let her be blamed, and I let her be buried so. There, you have it. Much good may it do the dead. It was as much as such a man could be brought to say, and more than his own interest wished him to, and the room let it fall into a dreadful quiet, in which the only sound was the thaw dripping from the eaves, and, after a moment, the broken breathing of the old master, Sir Audland, who had sat down again, as if his legs were struck from under him, and put his face into his 2 hands. For the thing that was settled at that table was not, in the end, the money, and was not even the steward's ruin, but a proud old man learning, 8 years too late, that the wife he had doubted to her death and quarrelled over to the edge of his grave had been true to him all along, and that he had broken her, and broken his son, and broken his house, upon a lie he had been too proud and too easily worked to see through. And there is no harder thing for such a man to bear, and he bore it, with his face in his hands at the table he had once been master of, while his dead wife's name came clean in the room about him. The parson Mr. Quaintance rose, gentle and grave, and said that he had married the father to that sweet lady 40 years gone, and christened the son, and buried the mother, and that he thanked God he had lived to see her name made clean, and that the dead were in better keeping than man's, but that the living in this room had a mending to do that was long overdue, and might begin this day. And old Dr. Skirrow said his conscience was eased at last that he had spoken, and Mr. Bellingham was suffered to rise, grey and shrunk and old, and his attorney, Mr. Tarrant, who had come with him and sat appalled through the hall, and had not opened the japanned tin of papers he had brought, gathered his man up and made for the door. And Sir Odland lifted his ruined face at the last, and said only, not loud, that the man should go, and go far, and that whether the law should follow him for the forgery and the theft was more than the old broken master could think on this day, but that he should never again be seen in that dale, nor in any house of the family's, while a Daventry lived. And Mr. Osric Bellingham, who had come up the thawing dale at noon, a smooth and trusted man, secure in a 30-year lie, went down it again before dark, a broken and a branded one, the lie torn off him at last, in the very house and the very room where he had built it, and was gone out of the dale and out of their lives, by another's hand than any of theirs, by the dead woman's, who had set the truth down, dated, and locked it away to keep, and so reached out of 8 years' grave to break him when no living accuser could. When he was gone, and the room quiet, there was the harder and the dearer reckoning left, the one between the 3 living, the father and the son who had not spoken in 5 years, and the dead gentlewoman between them now made clean. It was Sir Odland who moved first, the proud old man, broken open at last. He rose from the table and went to where his son stood pale by the fire, and looked at him, the grown grave son, so like his mother about the grey eyes, and tried to speak and could not, and Crispin, who had carried 8 years' cold blame of his mother, and 5 years' cold quarrel with his father, and had that very hour been given back, the one and undone in the other, looked at the broken old man, and saw, for the first time since he was a boy, not the proud father who had chosen his whole life and then quarrelled away from him, but only an old man who had been as cruelly deceived as the dead woman herself, and as long and far more to his own undoing. And the iron went the last of the way out of the son, and he put out his hand to his father, and the old man took it in his 2 shaking ones, and neither of them said a word, for there were no words made for that hour. But the long silence between Raphael's 2 living masters ended there by the fire, with the dead woman cleared above them on the table, and her gentle grey eyes on them both from the portrait Marian had carried down at last and set on the chimney-piece, facing the room, the right way, where she had always belonged. And Marian Daventry stood a little apart by the dark window where she had stood the night she gave him the book, and watched the father and son she had given back to one another keep their broken silence by the fire, and did not go to them, for the hour was theirs, and not hers. And she felt, for the first time since she had married a stranger for shelter on the hardest day of the winter, that she was not a stranger in that house, and not a bargain, and not the cold stroke a hurt man had dealt his father, but the hand that had read the page no one else could read, and so had thawed a frozen house from its locked heart outward. And she thought of the gentle dying woman who had set the truth down, dated for a calm later hand to find, and she knew herself to be that hand. Come 8 years on, a daughter Lady Cecily could never have foreseen, and yet had written for, and she was content. It was that evening, when the old father had been got to a warm bed in his own old house at last, and the house lay quiet, that Crispin Daventry came to his wife by her fire, and stood, and was not cold, and was not guarded, but only grave and shaken and changed. And he said to her the thing that mended the marriage, as the day had mended the house. He said that he had wed her to spite his father, and had told her so to her face, and was ashamed now, past speaking of the cold use he had made of a good woman to serve a hurt of his own, that she had taken his cold bargain, and given him back his mother and his father and himself, and asked nothing, and that he had no right in the world to ask of her now the thing he found he wanted to ask, which was that the marriage they had made cold might be let, by her leave, and, in her own time, to grow into a true one. For he had married a stranger to wound a man, and had found, too late to deserve it, that he had married the one woman in England he could love, and did. And Marian, who had married him with her eyes open for shelter, and had come, by the slow firelit inches of that strange winter, to a thing she had not let herself name, looked at the thawed and grave and honest man, who had been a locked door when she came, and was a man now, and she gave him her hand, the ink-marked, patient hand that had read his mother's truth. And she said that the marriage might grow as he wished it, and would, for it had begun to already, and they both knew it. And he took the thin gold ring from his own smallest finger, his mother's ring, and put it on his wife's hand above the too large band he had married her with in the cold church without asking the size, and it fitted, and that was the whole of their true wedding, by the fire in the thawing house, told to nobody but the old hound on the hearth. The winter broke for good that week, and the spring came up the dale, and Rayfell came up out of its 8 years' frost with it. The locked east wing was open to the air and the light, the holland stripped off, and the shutters folded back, and the dead hearths swept and lit, and the late mistress's own room aired and warmed, and kept now not as a tomb, but as a memory honoured, her portrait restored to its place over the daybed, and a glass of forced snowdrops set on the sill where the brown ring of the old dead flowers had been. For the room need not be shut any longer, now that the truth that had been locked in it was out, and the house could bear at last to remember the woman instead of freezing around the not-bearing of her. The great cold east face of the house showed light in its windows of an evening for the first time in 8 years, and the frost went off the inside of the panes, and the chimneys that had stood smokeless smoked again. And the Dale, which had thought Rayfell a dead house with a living ghost in it, saw the windows lit and the smoke up, and the young master riding out of a morning with his head up at last, and knew that something long frozen there had thawed, though only a few ever knew the whole of what. Sir Audland did not go back into his exile. The old man stayed at Rayfell, in his own old rooms, mended and quiet and much aged but no longer eaten from within by the lie, and he and his son, who had 8 years and 5 to make up, and not many years left to make them up in, made them up slowly and gravely, in the way of proud reticent men, by small daily company rather than by speeches, riding the land together, and going over the long tangled affairs of the wreck the steward had made, and setting right what could be set right. And the old man grew gentle at the last of his life, in a way he had never been in the strength of it, having learned the hardest way a proud man can learn the worth of a truth and the cost of a doubt. And he came, in those mended months, to love the daughter-in-law his son had married to spite him. For he saw plainly that it was she who had given him back his wife's good name, and his son's hand, and his own peace, and he told her so once, stiffly, the proud old way, that she had done for his house what none of his blood had been able to do, and that his son had builded better than he knew, marrying for spite, and getting a wife worth the whole of the rest of them. And Marian, who had been called a bargain and a stroke, and a cold convenience in that house, was called by the old master at the last its saving, and valued it more than the 100 a year. The wreck of the estate's affairs was slowly drawn straight. The full reckoning of what Bellingham had stolen over the years came near, when the books were honestly gone through, to a great sum, the most of it long past recovering. But enough of his own ill-got property was come at, and enough of the false mortgage shown forged and so void that the worst of the ruin was lifted, and the southern seat, though it could not be bought back, ceased to be a debt dragging the family down, and Rayfell itself, the Dale house, that had been kept up only by halves through the cold years, was put in heart again under a young hand, and a thawed one. The east wing roofed sound, where the storm had broken it, the cold rooms lived in, the home farm and the cottages that had gone to neglect in a grief-bound house, taken in hand and mended. Whether the law should be set on the vanished steward for the forgery, the family in the end let lie. For the old master had no stomach to drag his dead wife's wrong and his own long folly through the public courts of the county, and was content that the man was broken and branded and gone, and the truth known where it most needed to be known. And Mr. Osric Bellingham passed out of that country, a ruined man under another name, and was heard of once or twice, low and lessened, in a far town, and troubled the Dale no more. And it was said that he could never abide thereafter to be reminded of a written book or a kept account, which was a small enough penance for what he had done, and more than such men commonly come to in this world. And the old hound Tarn, who had kept the dead woman's locked door 8 years faithfully through the whole long frost, lived to see it opened and her name made clean and her room warm again, and gave up his post at the last, for there was no need of it now. And he lay, in his old age, across the warm library hearth at his new mistress's feet of an evening, or in the sun on the forecourt flags that no longer stood white with frost, and was a young master's dog again in his last years, as he had been a young mistress's in his first. And when he died, full of years, one quiet summer night with the house warm and lived in about him, they buried him under the orchard wall, where the snowdrops his first mistress had loved came up thickest in the spring, and the new master and mistress thought it no shame to grieve for the faithfullest watcher their cold house had ever kept. The proverb of that mending Marian found, where she found most things written down. In the last leaf of her mother-in-law's diary, under the dated entries, a line the dying woman had set there as much for herself as for any reader, and that Marian took for the truest word on the whole matter and kept. For Lady Cecily had written, in her failing hand, "A wrong set down plain and dated will keep till it is wanted. I shall not be believed living, but I may be believed written." The dying woman had meant it of her own small book and her own small hope. It had come to mean a great deal more, that the truth, set down honestly and left to keep, will outlast the lie that buried it, and the death of the one who told it, and will speak when its hour comes, in a voice no smooth living man can talk down. And Marian, who had married into a frozen house, and found that truth locked at the heart of it, and carried it out into the light, believed it to the end of her days, and taught it to her own children after, who grew up at a Rayfell that was warm. For there were children, in the good years that followed, and they grew up in a house with every window lit and no door locked, and were taken as soon as they were old enough up into the once shut east wing to the warm bright room that had been their grandmother's, and shown her gentle grey-eyed portrait, and told, plainly and without shame, the true story of the good woman who had been wronged and had set the truth down and waited, and of the steward who had wronged her and been broken by her own dated hand, 8 years dead, and of how their father had wed their mother coldly to spite a grandfather they now loved, and how their mother had thawed the whole cold house by reading a page no one else could read. For it was a story the family no longer hid, having learned the dear cost of the hidden thing, but told, as a thing to be proud of and to learn from. The warm words said openly in the lit room where the cold lie had once been locked. And Marian and Crispin Daventry, who had begun as a bargain on the hardest day of a hard winter and grown by firelit inches into a true and tender marriage, kept the rest of their long lives at the Thord house and were happy in it with the grave, deep happiness of two people who married as strangers and earned their love after, which some say is the surer kind, and the old wrong that had frozen 2 generations of one family was not only mended, but turned in the end to the warm centre of the house's pride, the proof in their own blood that a true thing kept will outlast a false thing told, and that even a marriage begun in spite may be thawed to a true one, if there is found in it one patient hand willing to read and to wait, and to carry the truth out of the cold and into the light. If you have stayed with me by this hearth to the close of the story, I should be glad of one quiet word from you below. Tell me the county or the country you are listening from this evening, and tell me one thing of your own keeping: a letter, a book, a name, a kept account, that holds a truth you mean to leave behind you plain and dated for someone you love to find. And if you have ever stood in your own life where this story sets 2 hard goods side by side, I should like to know which way your own heart leans, whether you believe, with the gentle woman who wrote the diary, that the surest answer to a lie is the truth set down quietly and left to keep till its hour comes, however long the cold must be borne in the meantime, or whether you would say, with the young wife who carried it out, that a truth locked away does no good to the living, and must be found and spoken and acted on by a warm hand before the frost takes the whole house. There is no wrong answer between them. There is only your own. If this telling has been a comfort to your evening, you are warmly welcome to stay by this hearth a while, for there is another Whispers of Love story waiting in its turn, of a sea captain's widow on the cold Northumberland coast, and the harbour light she would not let go dark through a winter of waiting, and I should be glad of your company at it. Until then, be at your ease, and at your hearth, and at your hour, and up at the Thord house above the river, when the telling is done and the lamps are lit along the east wing that stood so long dark, the gentle grey-eyed woman looks down from her place over the warm hearth in the room she died in, where her own diary lies open now under a glass for the children to read from, dated and plain and proved, and the snowdrops she loved stand fresh in the glass on the sill where the frost once furred the pane, and the truth she set down in the cold and trusted to keep still, and warms the house that the lie once froze, and tells, to all who come after, no lie, and wants no hand but the one that loves it